Hello, I'm Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. A number of years ago, I starred in The Chapman Report, a film about the sex studies of Dr. Alfred Kinsey. Like most Americans, I felt at the time that Dr. Kinsey's work was groundbreaking, and it was. But since then, serious questions have been raised about the Kinsey research methods, serious enough to warrant a closer look. What would you think if you learned that some of the most important scientific research of the century may have been based on fraud, or if not fraud, criminal experimentation on children funded by the taxpayer? What if you learned that the results of this research are exerting a profound influence on our society today, ranging from how we deal with sex offenders to how, when, and what our children are being taught about sex? Not to mention why. Every parent in America needs to know the facts behind Alfred Kinsey's inclusion of children in his famous sex studies in the late 1940s. Recent revelations about government-sponsored radiation experiments remind us once more of the dangers of projects that violate informed consent and the standards of common decency. As you watch this story unfold, you will learn how America has unknowingly put its children at risk in the name of science. And you may also join me in asking, what happened to Dr. Kinsey's smallest subjects? Where are the children of Table 34?
Children, our most precious gift and our hope for the future. Once upon a time, children were free to roam their neighborhoods without worry. Parents could count on the good intentions of neighbors, school officials, and other adults to keep their children safe. But in recent years, parents have had to take special measures to ensure that their children not come to harm. Their fears are not unfounded. Many children have fallen victim to sexual abuse. How do we go from a safe, caring environment for children to one in which parents are terrified that their children are at risk in just a few short years? Part of the answer may be found in Indiana, at the world-famous Kinsey Institute. In 1948, a zoologist named Alfred C. Kinsey shocked the world with his pioneering study, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. Although many scientists were critical of Kinsey's methods, the media popularized Kinsey's findings about sex. By 1981, Dr. Judith Reisman uncovered the role of child sexual abuse in the Kinsey studies in a paper presented to the Fifth World Congress of Sexuality in Jerusalem. She documented Kinsey's reliance on the systematic molestation of more than 300 infants and children from 2 months old to 15 years of age. Graph tables depicting sexual activity in children use identical criteria as those in the tables on adult subjects.
And I went back and I took a look at the Kinsey report, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. And as I reviewed the tables, it struck me as clear as day. How could they get this data? Where would they get these data? How did they know that a 2-month-old baby did or did not have an orgasm? How did they get a record of 26 orgasms in 24 hours for a 4-year-old? A 4-year-old.
If these experiments took place, they involved acts to which no child could provide consent and for which no parent or guardian could provide consent on behalf of the child. Therefore, we're talking about criminal activity, the criminal sexual abuse of children.
Research scientist Gordon Muir sees broad ramifications from Kinsey's work. According to Dr. Muir, who helped edit and publish Judith Reisman's and Ed Eichel's 1990 book, Kinsey, Sex and Fraud,
children as young as 2 months of age are featured in tables. In some cases, 188 children in one table, and the legend beneath the table says, timed with a second hand or stopwatch. The understanding that we have of childhood sexuality and normal childhood sexual development, as it is believed and taught in academia today, comes from the experimental evidence documented in Kinsey's Male Report published in 1948, with the child sexuality tables that we have just discussed. It is absolutely astonishing that this is taken as the basis for what we understand to be normal childhood sexual development. And when I try and explain this to colleagues in the type of science that I'm involved in what I call the harder sciences of biology and medicine, statistics, immunology, they frankly do not believe what I'm trying to tell them. And the only way that I can convince them of the truth of this is to go to the library, pull off the shelf one of Alfred Kinsey's books, and show them what in fact is inside. And it is quite shocking.
Based on the Kinsey data, sex researchers formulated a theory of child sexuality that's influenced everything from laws against molestation to how and when sex education is taught. Few professionals would disagree that Dr. Kinsey has been the most influential figure in the study of sex, particularly the concept of child sexuality.
He did not openly promote pedophilia, but he provided the, quote, scientific, unquote, basis for it. He felt the main problem with adult-child sexual relations was hysteria and overreaction on the part of parents and authorities. He believed that young boys needed the help of older people to develop effective sexual techniques. And he recorded that adult sexual contacts with young girls are a source of pleasure to these girls and may lead to better socio-sexual development in their later lives. His co-author, Wardell Pomeroy, a prominent sexologist, has written that the Kinsey research uncovered, quote, many beautiful and mutually satisfying relationships between fathers and daughters. Pomeroy also, in his sex education book, Boys and Sex, refers to the possibility of, quote, loving sexual relationships, unquote, between children and animals.
Children have been increasingly portrayed sexually in major pornographic magazines.
In our study conducted for the U.S. Justice Department, particularly juvenile justice and delinquency prevention, we came up with some pretty surprising findings on the images of children in Playboy, in Penthouse, and Hustler. In particular, Playboy and Penthouse was surprising to us. We were instructed to do the research because of the finding of these kinds of materials being used in sexual activities, sexual crimes, really, against children. Most disturbing was that 29% of the visuals, that is, the photographs, included some sort of nude or genital display. Very, very surprising. 21% were visually exposed and sexualized. 20% had some sort of genital activity taking place of some type. 10% involved force, 10% killing or murder.
Before Kinsey, psychologists had rejected the idea of children as sexually viable until the age of puberty. Earlier this century, Sigmund Freud paved the way for Kinsey by asserting that children were sexual, but that their sexuality was latent, that is, not acted upon until puberty. Kinsey's report radically altered this perception, spawning an entire industry based on the notion that children have a right to sexual relations at any age. The Kinsey perception of the right of children to have sex at any age has resulted in challenges to laws protecting children from sexual exploitation.
In Florida recently, a state court judge threw out several cases that had been brought under the statutory rape laws. Citing privacy grounds, the judge found that minors under the age of 16 had a constitutional right to engage in sexual activity. Several courts have recently held that parents do not have a right to stop school districts from handing out condoms to their children. Again, you see in school districts and courts and the media, the Kinsey philosophy that children should be free and autonomous to decide for themselves what sort of sexual activity, what sort of sexual behavior they should engage in without any kind of regulation or restriction from the state or their parents, has begun to chip away at the protections that our legal system had previously provided to children.
Some scientists feel that an inquiry of the Kinsey Institute is long overdue.
I have been in contact with perhaps the best-known fraud specialist in this country over a period of years concerning this Kinsey research fraud allegation. The person I'm referring to, of course, is Walter Stewart, who is well known in Congress and in the scientific community for his work in the Baltimore case particularly, and in other cases. Now, Stewart is firmly of the opinion that there is something here that needs to be investigated and has told me so many times.
Muir says that such an effort may be mounted outside the United States and cites a letter by Walter Stewart to the Canadian Medical Journal.
What Stewart said was that he finds the evidence, that is, for fraud and ethical violations in research, compelling, since the evidence comes almost entirely from Kinsey's book itself. He says, I find it disturbing and believe it requires investigation.
Dr. Muir says he hopes that Congress will investigate the Kinsey Institute once it's widely known that children may have been used in sexual experimentation.
Because there is a mess here that has to be cleared up in the backyard of American science, and it would indeed be tragic if it gets cleared up from elsewhere first.
Important questions need to be answered. Where are the children today? How were they procured for the experiments? Did their parents know they were being used in sessions with avowed pedophiles? Where are the children of Table 34?
I'm concerned about these people who must now be in their 50s, that they must have had some very difficult experiences following these experiments, and it would be good, really, if they could be contacted even for therapeutic purposes at this stage. I often wonder if they'll come forward when we're speaking in lectures or speaking on radio or whatever it may be. I've been waiting to hear for some of these people to remember the experience and to come forward and say, yes, I was one of those.
Based on 12,000 interviews, empirical observation, and Kinsey's own ideas about sexuality, the Kinsey Report, as it came to be known, had enormous cultural and scientific impact.
You could use the findings from the survey to counter the moral judgments of other people. And that's really the importance of Kinsey. As Kinsey moves the argument away from the old kind of sterile debate about morality, for which there is no solution, to a place where people can start talking about sexuality as in a different kind of way, looking to different kind of standards.
Kinsey concluded that Americans' sex lives were far more varied than had been thought, and that children were sexual from birth. But the Kinsey books have serious flaws, as has been noted by the National Research Council and Dr. Abraham Maslow, who warned Kinsey that sex surveys tend to skew the data toward the sexually promiscuous and unconventional. Because sexual manipulation of children is illegal, the Kinsey studies have served as virtually the sole source for sex researchers. The Kinsey findings about children are based on interviews with and records kept by pedophiles, which he described as adult males who've had sexual contacts with younger boys and who, with their adult backgrounds, are able to recognize and interpret the boys' experiences.
As a practitioner, a psychologist, I cannot see that this is the way in which we collect information about normal childhood sexuality. To get paedophiles to go out and do experiments on children is not how we learn about normality.
Kinsey acknowledges that some of the experiments involve the use of physical force with unwilling participants. Kinsey describes what he terms orgasms by the children, a gradual and sometimes prolonged buildup to orgasm, which involves still more violent convulsions of the whole body, heavy breathing, groaning, sobbing, or more violent cries, sometimes with an abundance of tears, especially among young children. Some of the children exhibited extreme trembling, collapse, loss of color, and sometimes fainting. The males in the present group will fight away from the partner and may make violent attempts to avoid climax, although they derive definite pleasure from the situation. A fretful babe quiets down under the initial sexual stimulation, is distracted from other activities, begins rhythmic pelvic thrust, becomes tense as climax approaches, is thrown into convulsive action, often with violent arm and leg movements, sometimes with weeping at the moment of climax. According to Paul Gebhard, a Kinsey Report co-author and former president of the Kinsey Institute, the researchers were aware that the experiments were illegal.